can all agree that the COVID pandemic was a terrible, terrible event for all of us. One notable area we at Church Times and others I know noticed was the rediscovery of the Psalms as a source of lament, praise and hope, especially when churches were closed. And we feel that interest hasn't waned, and that's one of the reasons why we were keen to put this on. So this renewed appetite will be the focus of the day, where hopefully we have an appreciation and an understanding of the Psalms and their application today. COVID also meant that the cancellation of events allowed Malcolm the time to finish his book, David's Crown, Sounding the Psalms, which I think you finished in record time, really. And we were delighted to publish this in 2021, and we're going to hear more from this book a bit later on today. So Malcolm and Roger will be with us all morning. The first session is called The Book of Praises, looking at the Psalms of Praise, and the second session is called Praise and Passion. So, our speakers. Roger is an artist and poet, honorary fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford. Among his recent exhibitions was Stanley Spencer, Roger Wagner at Cookham, and there is a permanent collection of his work at the Faith Museum in Bishop Auckland. 30 years ago, he began translating and illustrating the Psalms, and a selection of these was published by Canterbury Press as the Book of Praises. He has a new exhibition opening in London at the Lavery, opposite the V&A in November, called The Further Away. Malcolm Guite is a poet and priest, Life Fellow of Girton College, Cambridge. His books, many of which are bestsellers, are published by Canterbury Press, include David's Crown, Sounding the Seasons, 70 Sonnets for the Christian Year. In 2023, he was awarded the Archbishop Lanfranc Medal by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So please let's welcome both speakers in the traditional way. So thank you, Malcolm and Roger.
Well, thank you. Let's see if we can raise this. Is this close enough? Close enough for jazz? Right, well, it's lovely to be here, and it's particularly nice to be here with Roger. As you'll hear, we had, without knowing it, we'd each begun these very deep dives into the Psalms, which had been deepened further by the experience of COVID and lockdown. And eventually we worked that out, and then realized that Canterbury Press was doing both his Book of Praises and my David's Crown. So they're all in fact, we did another collaboration during lockdown. I wrote a series of poems called Quarantine Quatrains, which is like a sort of modern retake on the Ruby out of Omar Khayyam. And Roger very kindly did some illustrations for that. So we're going to each speak in this first session, and then we're going to speak in conversation about a particular psalm. So we wanted to concentrate on praises. Roger will tell you about the title of his book, The Book of Praises, and the original titling of the Psalms. I thought I'd just tell you and illustrate for you the story of how I began David's Crown, which is called Sounding the Psalms. It's not like Roger's, a fresh translation or new version of the Psalms. What it is really is a kind of prayer diary of reading through the Psalms. So each poem is written in response to a psalm. It takes the psalm as its conversation partner or dance partner or starting place. And sometimes it's sheer delight, and we both know all the steps of the dance and love it. Other times it's a bit shy or awkward, or sometimes plain contrary. There are many psalms that you begin, you're in chapel, you're saying the office as perhaps as a priest or lay reader or deacon, and you start reading one of these imprecatory psalms, break the teeth of the ungodly. Really? I'm supposed to say that? And then you think, well, no, but Jesus said it. How did he do that? The extraordinary thing about the book of Psalms is, if you think about, I mean, you know, the book of the Psalms were originally organized, you know, in 5 books. And some early commentators think that this was a kind of conscious reflection of the 5 books of the Pentateuch. One way of understanding the Psalms in their context in the religion of Israel is to say that books like Exodus and Deuteronomy tell you the outer story of the dramatic events of enslavement in Egypt and awakening of awareness and the call out of Moses. But the book of Psalms gives you the inside story of it. Not the outward and visible events, but the inward and spiritual experience of what it was like either to have been, as it were, there at those events, or to be one of a people who remember them ritually and dramatically reenact them annually. What is the inside feel of all of that? So that's one way of thinking about the book of Psalms. But another way is to think of it as Jesus' prayer book. Jesus is constantly quoting and alluding to the Psalms. He seems in some parts of the Gospels to be alluding to himself in the Psalms. He quotes Psalm 8. It's a gesture towards himself. He's somehow to be found there. And of course, as we all know, with Psalm 22, he dies with the words of the Psalter on his lips. So that would be a reason in itself for a Christian to read the Psalms. But of course, throughout the New Testament, not just in the Gospels, but in the epistles and Acts as well, the Psalms are taken up by the first Christians enthusiastically as suddenly revealing more about who Jesus really is. So there is a properly Christocentric reading of the Psalms, even though they are written BC. This is not, as some people trendily want to say, cultural appropriation, because the first Jewish Christians used them, the both Jewish and Gentile Christian communities used them, and I think we've got a 2,000-year track record of inhabiting these poems, so I don't think somebody who's probably not read them can come along and say, oh, you know, you got them from the wrong religion. They are, and one of the people that Roger and I have been in conversation with is the wonderful Professor Sue Gillingham, the Oxford professor of the Hebrew Bible. And you can find on YouTube some conversations between the 3 of us about particular Psalms. And she has just published, I think, the 3rd volume, final volume, of an astonishing reception history of the Psalms, where you can go to any Psalm. You can get something that's original, sits im Leben, as the scholars like to say, the life situation that gave birth to it, its history within Judaism, rabbinical commentary, and then how the first Christians used it and saw it, and then the way it was used or illustrated in medieval manuscripts, psalters, and so on right up to the present day. And it's the adventures of any given psalm through time. And it's full of astonishing things and beautiful things. We'll be touching on Psalm 8 later. And Sue points out that when you get illustrations of Psalm 8 in medieval psalters, you almost always get the scene of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And you go, what? I know there's lots of strangely parabolic and prophetic things in the Psalms, but I didn't catch that one. And the reason why is, of course, that Jesus quotes it is because out of the mouths of babes and sucklings thou hast ordained wisdom. And they said, oh, let the children be quiet. So no, if the children weren't quiet, you know, the stones would sing out, but the children know more than you do, temple police. So therefore that psalm becomes associated in the Christian mind with a particular gospel episode. And that kind of thing goes on all the time. When I came to write David's Crown, I took an unashamedly Christocentric way of reading it. That's by no means the only way of reading it, and I respect the other ways of reading it. But I think I can be more honest and have more authenticity as a poet responding to the Psalms than by being the person I am in the age I am with the faith I have, than by trying to reconstruct and imagine what some rabbinical group in, AD 2 would have done with it. I'll leave that to the scholars. So as I say, mine is Christocentric. Now, why the Psalter in lockdown and why the particular form that I chose with David's crown. Sometimes the best way of finding out about what's happening in a poem is to write a poem in response to the poem. The great critic and theorist George Steiner, in his book Real Presences, suggests that we might have a moratorium on theoretical literary criticism, you know, where the critic sits invulnerable behind their banks of theory and thesis and then dissects the poem from a distance and is in no way exposed or vulnerable themselves in the way that the poet is. So Steiner suggests that perhaps if we had a 50 or 100-year moratorium on theoretical literary criticism, and we said, if you want to critique a work of art, do it with a work of art. Then we'll see what you know. And I certainly found by writing poetry out of these poems that I learned a great deal more about what was in them than I might have done in years of theoretical study. So, every so often I like to have a journey through the Psalter. Before lockdown, the previous time that I'd done it had been about 10 years before lockdown, when I walked the Cuthbert's Way between Melrose Abbey and Lindisfarne, Holy Island. And I'd read in Bede's Life of Cuthbert that Cuthbert knew the Psalter by heart, and that when he was walking, as he did, because every time the king gave him a horse, he gave it away to the next beggar and walked on foot with the poor, he would recite the Psalter. So I don't know the whole Psalter by heart, but I know quite fair bits of it. And my go-to translation has always been Coverdale's translation in the BCP. And so I took 5 days to walk this, and I thought, well, 150 Psalms, they're divided into 5 books anyway, 30 Psalms a day, 3 breaks in my walking, 10 Psalms, it's doable. So I did it. And it was a revelation because I realized that every other occasion on which I'd recited the Psalms, I'd had a roof over my head. I'd essentially read it as an indoor book. Reading it outdoors completely changes your perspective on it. It's an outdoor book. You suddenly realize, you know, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord, and the firmament showeth forth his handiwork, which my fluorescent strip lighting does not do. The high crags are a covering for the conies, or he leads me beside still waters, or I can find no footing in this mire. Set me on a rock that is higher than I. I look up to the hills. Whence cometh my help? Certainly not from the hills, because there's thunder and storm rolling down them. My help cometh from the Lord. I see the birds, and they're constantly, the flight of the birds becomes, you know, oh, that I had the wings of a dove. When you're about 2/3 of the way through a long quagmire day's walk, and a dove or a pigeon flits easily past you, you know, oh, that I had the wings of a dove. So the Psalms had come alive to me in that particular way. And when lockdown came, and it was very dramatic, you remember the Prime Minister just appeared on TV one evening and said, stay at home, you know, don't go to work tomorrow. It wasn't as if we had a long time to prepare for it or anything. And then there was this extraordinary stricture, you may remember, that we were to be allowed out for an hour's exercise. And as we had 2 greyhounds that needed more than an hour, my wife and I couldn't even go out and walk together. We had to take it turns to walk the dogs. So I went out, you know, for my exercise. And we were lucky, we lived in a village, we were in Linton, and just down from it, I could find, you know, the Icknield Way went through, there was walking, and I was allowed to walk, so it's much better than my daughter, who was cooped up in a flat in Manchester. So I began that walking that first day of lockdown, and I thought, you know, I'm gonna do that thing I did on the Cuthbert's Way for, I guess the lockdown will probably be 3 or 4 weeks, maybe a month, you know. I can read the Psalter in that time. So I took out my little green prayer book with Coverdale in it, and I went on my walk, and there's a bit walking along the River Granter where you cross the stream, and just near where you cross it, this is the upper waters of the Granter, it's not, there was a beautiful chestnut which was rooted right on the bank, but the part of the roots were exposed and literally did go down to the water. So I'd stopped on this bridge to start my recitals of the psalm with Beatus Vir, blessed is the man. You know, I mean, the reason why Coverdale kept all those Latin titles, you know, Beatus Vir, De Profundis, you know, Dominus Illuminatio Mea, all the words, was because it was such a newfangled thing. His translation is earlier, 16th century, precedes the prayer book, that priests who were used to reciting in Latin couldn't work out where they were in the newfangled English version. So he gave them the first phrase in Latin just to remind them, oh, it's Beatus Vir, okay, I know what this is about. So Beatus Vir, blessed is the man. But the lovely thing for us is that we see the word beatitude in the word beatus, and we suddenly realize the very phrasing of the Sermon on the Mount depends on Jesus' deep familiarity with this first psalm. Blessed is the man who, blessed are those, blessed are the poor. It's like a beatitude. So I was stood there on this bridge, contemplating the tree, which was one of my favorite trees, without really thinking about what it was coming. Blessed is the man that hath not walked in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stood in the way of the sinners, nor sat in the seat of the scornful. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he shall exercise himself day and night. And because we just heard the word exercise from the lips of the obviously fit and well-toned and exercised Prime Minister of the day, I suddenly thought, oh, well, this can be my exercise. I will exercise myself in the Psalms while I'm exercising myself, you know, with the dogs in the morning. And then, of course, came that line. He shall be like a tree planted by the waterside that will bring forth his fruit in due season. His leaf also shall not wither. And I looked at the tree, and there it was, you know, the very emblem in the psalm. And I thought, I'm going to make this tree my sort of ensign and emblem, and perhaps even my totem pole for the experience of lockdown. It's a good image for lockdown because that tree is not going anywhere, and neither am I, you know. So I'm going to have to learn rootedness. And then, of course, the psalm ends with this contrasting line. As for the ungodly, it is not so with them, but they are like the chaff which the wind scattereth away from the face of earth. So a contrast image of you have the opportunity to be rooted and fruitful, or we can be detached and rootless and deracinated, as they say, and just be blown away by every wind, including the many contradictory gusts that blew through us in those days of lockdown. So I thought, oh great, okay, I'll do the Psalms. And then, you know, we all went a bit crazy, I think, in lockdown, and a kind of crazy idea came to me. I had been, as we learned more about what's going on, you know, and the thing coming from Wuhan, and we all learned to say coronavirus, just by sheer word association, I decided to dig out a sequence of poems by John Donne, sequence of 7 sonnets called La Corona. So the word corona was in the air, you know, quite literally. So La Corona is a very beautiful sequence. But corona, which of course means crown, it's inside the word coronation, and it was called the coronavirus because the little spikes on it looked under the electron microscope, bizarrely like a crown. So corona is also a technical term for a form of poetry sequence, a form of sonnet sequence. And it works like this. The last line of the first sonnet is the first line of the second sonnet. The last line of the second sonnet is the first line of the third sonnet. But then what makes it a corona is that the final line of the final sonnet is the first line of the first sonnet. So it links round. And John Donne's Corona is addressed to Christ. It's very beautiful. It goes from the Annunciation to the Ascension. And it goes through, as it were, you know, into the, and it's addressed to Christ. And obviously Donne couldn't write it unless he had a line that was good enough, not only to invitingly open it, but could also be the last line. And in Donne's case, he chose the line addressing to Christ. Deign at my hands this crown of prayer and praise. I deign to receive. So he offers it at the beginning and then he concludes, deign at my hand this. And you should read those poems, they're absolutely wonderful. The one on the Annunciation and the conception of Christ in the womb of Mary has one of the greatest lines ever, which is, immensity cloistered in thy dear womb. Absolutely superb. So I was thinking about that, standing on this bridge, the dog fretting to be going on, you know. And I suddenly thought, wow, why don't I write a Corona on the Psalms? It would be just like Dunn's, except instead of 7, it would be 150. And then I thought, oh, it would be really cool if, in fact, instead of it being sonnets, I made it 15-liners. And I did them in Dante's form of terza-rima, so it would be 5 3-liners. Yeah, I can see I was getting seriously train-spotted at this point. You know, so that way, since it's iambic pentameters, there'd been 10 syllables in each of the lines, the 15 lines. So it'd be 150 syllables in the poem, which is 150 psalms, and you know, etc. So I then realized, and this is really what I'm building up to here, is I realized that I couldn't write, not only could I not write Psalm 1, my poem on Psalm 1, without looking at Psalm 2, because my landing place at the end of Psalm 1 was going to be my springboard from Psalm 2. But then I suddenly realized I couldn't even start my poem on Psalm 1 until I knew the very last line of my poem on Psalm 150. Oh my goodness. So actually this turned out to be brilliant. This is what you might call teleological thinking, or, you know, as Tom Wright says, the end is in the middle. I knew my Psalter pretty well, and I'd often use the Psalter on dark days, and I knew how dark it gets, you know. As Dylan says, it's not dark yet, but it's getting there. And until you reach the absolute nadir of unredeemed pitch blackness, in which there's not even a nevertheless, I will praise you or anything, you know, in Psalm 88, when he says, you know, my friends and my lovers, thou hast put far from me, and I'm in the dark. I knew we were going to have to be there. So it was great before I got there to be reminded that the final 5 psalms and finally the final psalm are just sheer doxology, sheer praise. So I needed a line which was both an invitation into the entire exercise and also a fitting conclusion. And I probably would never have written it at all. But I stood there, you know, breathing the free air, being anxious about breath itself, the sense that it was the breathing, you know, we were already seeing these people intubated. I was grateful that I stood free in a country place above a river looking at a tree which held its breathing. And so the line came to me, come to the place where every breath is praise. And that would be the invitation, come to it. That at the end of this extraordinary roller coaster emotional ride, we would all, and in the promise of God, we would all come to the place where every breath is praise. So that's how it started. And an immediate effect was that instead of reading Psalms or even bits of Psalms in isolation, that's kind of favorite passages or proof texts or anything else, I was constantly forced to pay attention to the relationship to the Psalms in sequence. And as we'll see in our second session, that really taught me something about the passion of Christ and his resurrection in the Psalms. But what I want to do now, and you have it on your handout, you should have from me a handout which is on two double printed sides. And the order to have it is the first one you should have facing you 1 Beatus Vir. And then the second sheet you should have facing you 23 Dominus Regit Me. That's the order in which to have these. But we won't be using them both in the first session. So, I'm going to just give you an idea of how this worked, and I'm going to read the 2 poems, Beatus Vir and Quare Fremere Gentes. I've already mentioned Psalm 1. Just to remind you of where Psalm 2 goes, Psalm 2 has that great opening question. Why do the heathen so furiously rage together? And why do the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth stand up and the rulers take counsel together. Imagine, well, perhaps you did read that as waves of panic washed back and forth across the airwaves, as people screamed at each other, as Americans tried to politicize the virus, and that happened to some degree on our side, and you know, all of that was going on. Suddenly those lines, why all this raging? Where is the still point? Became evident. I'm going to read you the one for Psalm 2 as well, because I took myself by surprise. I love Coverdale. Most of the poetry I read goes up to and includes, delicate, metaphysical sonnets by the likes of Herbert and Donne. My danger is always slipping back into that world. And I actually, to be honest, didn't expect to encounter anything particularly modern in this reworking of the Psalms. But by the time I got to Psalm 2, it was already happening. A friend of mine in America who'd called out some horribly misogynist and in fact abusive behavior in a conservative church in America was suddenly become the target of a Twitter storm and horrible trolling against her. And I had her in mind when I wrote the second. I never ever expected to include the word Twitter in a poem, ever. But there it was. So that gave me a clue as to how this is going to work. So let me conclude my bit here by just reading you those two poems, and then I'm going to hand over to Roger. So hear them, and you'll see how the linking thing works. I'll just read them in sequence. Beatus Vir. Come to the place where every breath is praise, and God is breathing through each passing breeze. Be planted by the waterside, and raise your arms with Christ beneath these rooted trees, who lift their breathing leaves up to the skies. Be rooted too, as still and strong as these, open alike to sun and rain. Arise from meditation by these waters. Bear the fruit of that deep rootedness. Be wise in the tree's long wisdom. Learn to share the secret of their patience. Pass the day in their green fastness and their quiet air. Slowly discern a life, a truth, a way where simple being flowers in delight. Then let the chaff of life just blow away. Quaere fremurent gentes. Then let the chaff of life just blow away. The cynic scoffer and the evil troll, the hunters and the haters who hold sway in raging Twitter storms, the ones who scroll through hate and hit lists in their tiny rage, are dust upon the mirror of your soul. Blow them away, the idols of this age, and let their fury settle in the mire. Uncap your pen and open a clean page, for now the Lord will give you your desire and set you high upon his holy hill. He draws you to the garden, through the fire, back to the fountain, whence those waters spill that christened you as his beloved child, that you may find your peace in his goodwill. So a few echoes of Dante there as well. So that shows you the approach, and you'll get more of a taste of that as we go on in the day. Now, my friend Roger, the artist and poet, can give you something of what he was doing at the same time with similar material.
Just move that a bit higher. Can you hear me there? Great. Well, that line of Malcolm's, come to the place where every breath is praise, I think expresses something that is right at the heart of a really extraordinary collection of poems that we call the Psalms or the Psalter. And it is actually an extraordinary collection. I mean, we've got lots of ancient poems, but I can't think of any that actually form a kind of unique sequence in the same way that the Psalms do. And this idea of praise runs right through that collection. Now, I think it explains why these poems have always been at the center of Jewish and Christian communal religious life, and why they've been such have such importance for our own individual spiritual lives, and why they've been actually a really unique source of musical and literary and artistic creativity, and why, incidentally, they've been such an inspiration I've found in my own artistic life. The Hebrew title of the collection is Sefer Tehillim, the Book of Praises. And the praise of God is, as I said, the kind of unifying theme. It's, as it were, what musicians would call the cantus firmus, that runs through the whole collection. It begins, as Malcolm said, with the individual, the man who delights in the law of the Lord. And it ends with the full orchestra of creation, everything that has breath, singing the great hallelujah. And in between, it takes us on a journey through the whole gamut of the darkness and light of human experience, holding on to the praise of God as a kind of golden thread to guide us through the journey. So, I mean, what is it about praise that gives it this sort of central importance? The scientist and philosopher Ian McGilchrist often talks about attention as a moral act, because he argues that what we attend to determines the world in which we live. But I think you could actually go further and say that attention is a spiritual act, because what we attend to and the way in which we attend to it determines who we are and the spiritual world in which we live. So to look at God's creation and to see its value is, you might say, a repetition in the finite mind of the Creator's primal act of creation, of looking at creation and seeing that it is good. That's what we're doing when we're praising creation. And to look at God and to see his goodness is, as it were, to become a mirror of the Creator, an image of God. But this is not to sort of crassly ignore suffering or the darkness of life. It's not looking in that kind of crass way on the bright side of life and ignoring everything outside it. It's rather to look beyond it to something more fundamental, a truth beyond the truth. So Psalm 8, which if we have that first image, which Malcolm talked about, and it's actually the psalm that I recite every night. Adonai Adonenu, dear Shemcha B'chol Haaretz, Lord our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. It tells us that and then sort of goes on to talk about how from in that line that Jesus quotes, how from the mouth of children and suckling babies you have ordained praise, or ordained a stronghold of praise against the opponent, to silence the enemy and the avenger. And it's an extraordinary line, an extraordinary sort of concept. And it seems to sort of tell us that the innocent pleasure and gratitude of even the smallest child establishes the reality of God's goodness against everything that might try to contradict it. And so the image that, when I was illustrating this, I had in mind that, partly because it then, of course, goes on to talk about when I look at the heavens, the moon, your heavens, the moon and the stars which you have created, what is man that you are mindful of him? I had in mind that image that Newton talks about at the beginning of the, well, I think he is recorded by a friend that he said that when he thought of all that he had done, he thought it was just like a small child playing with a bright sort of shell on a beach, and where the great ocean of God's truth lay all before him yet to be discovered. And so that was my sort of, I was trying to sort of combine those two images of the child and the stars, and the attention to the small and the great. Can you see? Yeah, you can see the image. Oh yes, actually, if we have there's another one. You can see it a bit. The next image, you can see that a bit. Yeah, there we are. So that gives it a bit closer.
I have to say next.
Yes. No, thank you. Yes, I forget which pictures I've got here, so I can't see them myself. So. Let's just go on to the next one. I can't now remember what comes after that. It's the whole. That's the page in the book there. When you have both a big one and a small. So if praising God Himself makes us a kind of image, a mirror. As when you praise something, you actually, it's. I think Lewis talks somewhere about sort of praising something as being the completion of enjoying it. It's until you actually praise, you don't really see what it is, and so that's why praising God makes us, as it were, a kind of mirror of God. God fills our whole attention, and I think that explains why it is that the Psalms themselves have been such an extraordinary source of musical and literary and artistic creativity. Where the poems originally came from is, like all poetry, somewhat mysterious. Malcolm and I were talking like that. It's very hard to say where even poems you write yourself actually come from. They just sort of, grow and appear in the mind. And so what the actual process of where the sort of, the moment where these poems came, we can't exactly recover that. Many are attributed to King David. A number to a group of poet musicians, the sons of Korah, others to Asaph, or someone called Ethan the Ezrahite. But whatever the original circumstances of their composition, they have been caught up into the communal worship of Israel. And it's clear both from the superscriptions and from the continual references within them that these were poems were songs which were performed with music by singers and musicians against the visual background of the temple in Jerusalem, which from wall to floor was covered with overlaid with gold, with carved cherubim on it, and palm trees and open flowers. There are these wonderful descriptions, aren't there, of what the temple looked like, and these are kind of referenced continually within the Psalms. And so the destruction of this background, which is graphically described within the Psalms themselves, with axes and hatchets. They hack away all the engraved works. And obviously with it, with that sort of physical description, went the choirs and the musicians and the music. All the original psalm tunes, which are referred to again in the superscriptions, the hind of the dawn, lilies, doves of the far-off terebinths, do not destroy. All those have been lost. We have the words, but not the music. And yet, because these psalms are a celebration of the Creator God, it's as though they contain within them a seed of creativity. So there's, Malcolm was saying, and Sue Gillingham has sort of shown in her books. I brought a couple of those volumes just so you can look at and see. And in fact, she's just recently done a new Penguin Psalm commentary, which will be coming out soon, which is very much worth looking at. So for 2,000 years or more, the Psalms have inspired an extraordinary profusion of wonderful music. And then as they moved out of the, first into the Jewish diaspora, they were translated into Greek and Coptic, and then of course into the Christian world, into Latin, and then into all the languages of the world. They've inspired not only wonderful translations, but wonderful poetry, of which Malcolm's is obviously an example. And they've also, as the Psalms invite the reader to enter that life of the temple, they, as it were, invite us to rebuild the temple in our imagination and within our own inner being, so that they also contain a kind of seed of visual creativity, which manifested itself first in wonderful sort of architecture and decorated church buildings, beginning really early on in synagogues like the synagogue at Dura Europos and later on, but then of course in Christian churches all over the Mediterranean, which have begin from the sort of 7th or so century to have sort of gold mosaics echoing the gold of the temple. But then, with the invention of the codex or book, they begin to enter a kind of world of private devotion as well. So that the earliest known book of Psalms, we have the next image, is the Rudil Codex, which dates from the late 4th century, and that's an undecorated text, but it was placed under the head of a young girl in a poor Coptic cemetery, and soon these psalters in sort of book form began to use sort of colours. Next image. In the initial letters, and then sort of gold. It was called chrysography, so writing in gold. So the next image as well. You can see the whole thing sometimes written in gold. And then from the 7th and 8th centuries, began to appear the first of what became a long tradition of illuminated psalters. So again, the next picture. It was sometime in the 1990s. I was staying with some friends in Sheffield, and while waiting for them to return, I began, as you do, to look through their bookshelves and to see what they had done. One of the things that I found was a little leather-bound confirmation book, which was Ronald Knox's translation of the Psalms. And I'd never seen a complete little book of Psalms like that before. And I didn't actually particularly get on, though he was a great man, I didn't particularly get on with his translation. But that idea of a book of Psalms suddenly began to plant a seed in my own mind. Many years before that, when I was still at school, I'd visited the monastery of San Marco in Florence, where you can go up into the the monks, the friars of cells, where in each cell there's a fresco by Fra Angelico, and you could, in those days you could sit on a sort of cushion on the floor and just sort of contemplate it, and you sort of moved from one to the other, and it was an extraordinary. I mean, it was a very formative moment in my own spiritual journey. But it showed me how paintings could speak to sort of deep places in the soul. And because the Psalms are so various and so different from each other, and they speak to each kind of mood and shift in our spiritual weather, reading them can sometimes feel like sort of moving from one room to another, and walking through a spacious building, like the cells in San Marco. And it just seemed to me that it might be possible to do a book of Psalms which got something of that effect. So you could stop, as it were, with each psalm and look at a picture and sort of contemplate some aspect of it. And I'd sort of started, because I'd lived in Oxford, and it's very easy to sort of, there's a Jewish Studies Centre that was just down the road. I'd sort of started trying to learn some Hebrew, and it occurred to me you could do a sort of fresh translation with an image, and I sort of started this project of trying to do the whole Psalter, and I had no idea how long it was going to take me, and that was 30 years ago, so, and I still haven't got anywhere near the end, but I'm working on it. So I started with Psalm 1, like as you might say. Here was my tree, which was on Port Meadow. It was and I thought, because English obviously goes in one direction and Hebrew goes in the other direction, you could use the different directions to kind of frame the images. So I have the two paths of the man planted by a tree, and then the chaff of life just blown away at the end. But I could use it in all sorts of different ways. So the next one was, so that was, Psalm 5, which ends with the line about, you surround us with acceptance as a great shield. So I had the English and the Hebrew surrounding the image, and the idea of a kind of angel, which I use that quite often in the illustrations. So this is sort of wings surrounding. And I found all sorts of different ways of using that, which we'll come to when we look at some of the later Psalms. Just keep an eye on the time. We've actually shot right. We're going to have our discussion. So.
I took too long at the beginning.
No, but that's fine. I'm going to skip quite a bit but I might just end. So I'll just go through the images quickly. Just different ways of putting those kind of wings. We'll talk about that psalm again later, and then the next one. So, just quickly, one of the most interesting things in the Malcolm was talking about the way that the New Testament uses. Well, it's actually the way that Jesus uses the Psalms. He says. That, right at the end of Luke's Gospel, he opens the minds of the disciples to read the scriptures and talks to them about how they can see him in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. And the earliest illustrated psalm books usually have an image of David and an image of Christ next to one another. And so if we just go on, that's the image of Christ, and then go on to the next one. And so I won't talk about that. I therefore use images from the New Testament very often in my illustrations. We'll just end here. This is Dura Europos. This is the place where the earliest church has been found, the earliest sort of house church. And if you have the next image, there's an early edition of me standing in, and that was the excavation in the 1930s. So this was destroyed in 250 AD. So these images come from. So that is okay. just go back a bit to the one before. Yeah, so that's the earliest illustration of the Psalms that we know. And it's over the baptistry in Dura Europos, and it shows a man obviously holding, it's Christ, the Good Shepherd. But if you can just make out, if you go on again to the next one, that, sort of below the image of Christ, there's the sheep by green pastures and drinking as a kind of river, and they're drinking from still water. So it's also an image of Psalm 23. Now we're almost done with time. I think, what should we do? Should we read the poem, or should we do the discussion?
How long are we on? We can
now
continue this next time. I mean, I think maybe we should, just because we're talking about the Book of Praises and the idea that, I mean, something that we both want to say is that there's something abundantly generous in the gift of the Psalter to us. Because, particularly for times when we feel tongue-tied and we feel speechless, at whatever is happening, God gives us the language. He gives us a voice of praise, but he also allows us to name the most horrible things and to express the anger that we feel. It's very, as the modern psychologists like to say, it's a very disinhibited book, But I think we were looking together at Psalm 30.
Yeah.
And you suggested I might run into Psalm 30 via Psalm 29.
Yes.
Which is about the gift of... And then maybe if I read my poem on Psalm 29, where you could talk about Psalm 30 and I'll just chip in.
So what we'll do, let's move this. And we're probably going to I'm afraid we're going to overrun our
Slightly
coffee
overrun
time
our
a
coffee
little
time.
bit, if that's okay. I'll take the microphone.
Yeah. I must say, while we're doing it, I remember when I first heard from Roger this whole story about visiting Europos, and this really is, one of the very earliest churches, and to see things that, we go to the funeral of our friends now, and we hear the psalm, the 23rd Psalm, and we think about the hope and trust of travelling, and I'll talk about that in the next session. To think there are those Christians, from the 1st or 2nd century, who've got the same thing, and see that psalm is also about Jesus. And the fact that drawings over a baptistry, that the waters of our baptism are also those waters that he leads us beside, whereby we trust him. It's wonderful. Okay, so Psalm 29 in the original thing has this notion of, it's the one about the voice of the Lord, like the voice of the Lord is mighty and it rends the terebinth trees, and it's about that sense of hearing God's voice through all creation, and then realizing that he gives us a voice too. So I'll just read my poem on this, not in the handout. Psalm 29. Call us, O Christ, and open up the gate. Call us to worship with your mighty voice, the voice that sings through rivers in full spate, the voice in which the forests all rejoice, the voice that rolls through thunder clouds and calls the deep seas and the steep waves, the quiet voice that stirs our sleeping conscience and recalls us to the love we had abandoned, leads us through the parting mists of doubt, or falls upon us like a revelation, pleads with us on the poor's behalf, blazes in glory from each burning bush, and bleeds out from compassion's wounds, the voice that raises our drooping spirits till we dance for joy, and gives us, too, a voice to sing his praises. And that, of course, had to be not only my landing point at the end of 29, but the opening line of Exaltabo Te Domine, Psalm 30. So I'm going to pass over to you on Psalm 30.
So I'll read you my translation of Psalm 30. If we could move on from the images, and you'll see, okay, that was Dura Europos, which, I'll just go back a second. When I was there, there are all these little boys with their little flocks of sheep, and they found that sometimes the best place for them to the greenest pasture was on the central reservation of the motorway. so that's a picture of one of the little boys with the sheep. So if we go on then to Psalm 30, the next one. Okay, so this is my translation of that. A hymn, a song at the dedication of the house of David. I will exalt you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up. You have not made my enemies exult over me. Lord my God, I cried to you for help and you healed me. Lord, you brought my soul up from the grave, from among those going down to the pit. You gave me life. Make music to the Lord, his loved ones, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is for a moment, his acceptance is life. At evening, weeping comes to stay, but in the morning is joy. But I, in my prosperity, I said, I will never be shaken. Lord, you established my mountain stronghold in your grace. When you hid your face, I became frightened. I will cry out to you, Lord. I will plead to my Lord. What gain is there in my blood when I go down to the pit? Will it declare your truth? Hear, Lord, and be gracious to me. Lord, be my help. You turned my mourning into dancing. You untied my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, so that my spirit will make music to you and not be silent. Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever.
That's wonderful. I love in your book of that, your dancing figures. Do you have one of just the
Yes,
dancing
we
figures?
go on.
The dancing figures
So,
in gold?
and the next one? No. Yeah, there we are, the dancing figures.
Yeah, I love that. That psalm in itself is almost an epitome of the whole Psalter, in that it finishes with this, heaviness may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. But it gives you the heaviness. It certainly expresses the anguish and the sense of not having a footing, yet it finishes with this great joy. So maybe we can just close this morning session if I read, and you have this on your handout.
Yes.
The response to Psalm 30.
Just before that, quickly, I'll show you the next of the images. So we just go back to the last one. So that line, which I think Coverdale has, grief endures.
Heaviness may endure for a night, but joy
Yes,
comes.
well, I mean, that is a possible translation, but actually the word really means comes to stay for the night.
Yeah.
So that I have it, if we go on next image, that one. So I used that, I sort of riffed on the image that Blake used of sort of death coming to stay, and then and it was an image that, if we go on to the next one, next one beyond that. Yeah, so that's Blake's image, and George MacDonald adapted that for his own bookplate. So in the next image still, yep. Okay.
Yeah. Oh yes, that's wonderful. But also in the George MacDonald, that gate is also the gate of life, and it's the open door of a book. It's opening a book and going into. So yeah, I found when I wanted to respond to Psalm 30, by this time, I was 30 psalms deep into this project, and God knows how deep we were into lockdown. And I think particularly that fear was large amongst us. But also, I think we got to the point where some of us were beginning to re-examine our priorities, especially those of us whose lives had involved a commute, and we were no longer doing that commuting. And we were with our partner, and we were alone, or we were still in the house. And a lot of us re-examined our priorities. And I kind of need to be reminded of that re-examination, because it's so easy to fall back into the old rushed lifestyle and forget what we learned. So that's kind of where this one is coming from. We'll close this session with this. So I pick up from the end of Psalm 29, which is he gives us too a voice to sing his praises. He gives us too a voice to sing his praises, so much the more because we were brought low, that we might know we have a God who raises up the lowly. Riches made us slow to love you, slow to turn to you in praise. But sudden loss and crisis made us know our true dependence on your love. Our days of false security are gone. We fell into a pit of our own making. Raise us up again, each out from our own hell, and give us oil for ashes, joy for mourning. Restore us in your love, and we will tell of how through our long night we heard your warning and heeded you and found your love again. How night withdrew and joy came in the morning. And your dancing figures of joy. So I think we'll draw stumps at that point. We can all have a coffee. We'll reassemble at 11:30. Is that right?